everybody. I'm Shannon Brescher Shea, and this is Sandi Schwartz, and we're going to start in just about a minute while we wait for folks to come on and notice that we're live. So she's going to be talking to me about my book. So yeah, and so we won't officially start just quite yet, but in case anybody's wondering, I wore this shirt on purpose. It's Rachel Carson.
Oh, very nice.
Who is a famous environmental activist. She wrote the book Silent Spring, for folks who have heard of that. In my day job, I'm a federal science writer, which was actually what she did as well. She was the head of publications for the Fish and Wildlife Service for probably about 20 years. Well, she was with Fish and Wildlife for about 20 years. I don't know how long she was actually head of publications for. So I see it's 7. Oh, there's 3 people on. Hi, everybody. So it's probably a good time to get started. So as I said, I'm Shannon Brescher Shea. I just wrote this book that came out last week called Growing Sustainable Together, Practical Resources for Raising Kind, Engaged, Resilient Children. It's about using environmental activities to teach your children to be good world citizens, to be emotionally resilient, to understand the world around them, to understand their impact on the world around them in a better way. And it ranges everything from using gardening and biking to transportation to environmental activism and volunteerism, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And Sandi Schwartz is with me.
Hi, how are you today? Did you have a good day?
Yeah.
Good weather up there?
That's hot. I live in DC. I mean.
Well, I'm in Florida, so it's even hotter.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about how we know each other? And
yeah, well, congratulations so much, Shannon. So I've been able to see Shannon through the entire process of getting this book out in the world. And all I know is she is the fastest writer I've ever met. And what's really cool is I forget how we actually connected online, but it turns out that we worked in the same office at the National Academy of Sciences in DC, and we met after the fact. Shannon was a few years behind me. And so then we actually met in person a few years ago in DC for a bloggers meeting. And then we met again out in Irvine, California for the ShiftCon conference. So, and now we're in a writing group together. So it's been really exciting to see her. And Shannon is now my book proposal and book writing mentor. So it's amazing how paths keep crossing, and we both are very passionate about children and the environment. So I'm excited to be here today, and just want to congratulate you so much on the book, Shannon. You worked so hard.
So Sandi's going to be asking me some questions. We also certainly welcome questions from the audience. So if you have questions, post them in the Facebook comment box. Yeah, do you want to get started?
Yeah, so my blog is happysciencemom.com, and I focus a lot on raising happy, balanced children with a lot of looking at stress reduction. And lately, I've been really focusing on how nature can reduce stress. So I read your book from that lens. And first of all, I want to say what I absolutely loved about the book is the storytelling aspect. I really actually felt like I was transformed into these events, that you were doing, whether it was the gardening event or the one where the event with on Capitol Hill, where the children were talking about climate change, the families. And I just loved how you did that. You really brought us there in those moments in time. And clearly your research was unbelievable, and the connections you made through it. So I actually I read her whole book, and I looked at what can I kind of take out of it that it affects my blog, that whole emotional piece. And so I wrote a post called How Environmental Activism Can Help Your Kids Feel Happier. And so let's start with that. I want to hear a little bit more about, what do you think about how getting involved in environmental activism and volunteerism, how does that benefit families and kids emotionally?
Absolutely. So I'll start with activism first, since you mentioned it first. basically kids know what's going on. You know, maybe younger kids aren't aware of, you know, things like endangered species and climate change, but certainly as children get older, they become very aware of these topics. Either they learn about them in school or they hear about them on the news. And there's been an increasing coverage of climate change in particular in the news in the last couple of years. You hear things like, you know, the Arctic Circle, it was as hot as it was in, you know, the Middle East the other day. And kids are going to have questions about that. And if you don't talk to them about that, they feel disempowered, they feel confused, and they feel frustrated. And one thing environmental activism can do is really what a couple of researchers called, of course I'm forgetting the phrasing, but it's basically optimism and feeling like you can make a difference and knowing how to without it really being rose-colored glasses, in a very practical, realistic way. Knowing that, you know, understanding systems of power is very empowering in and of itself. It's frustrating, you know, as any of us who have, especially recently, learned, you know, people who may not have thought of racism or racial systems of power recently have started to understand these systems. And at first it's just like overwhelming. But then as you grow to understand them and you grow to understand how to influence them and how people over history have influenced them, it can be very empowering. And then joining together with other people who care about the same things that you do is also a really amazing way to build community, to build relationships, both of which are really important to your emotional bonds, and to know that you're not alone about caring about these things. Because that's one of the most, I think, frustrating things. It's this feeling that like, I'm the only one who cares about this. I'm isolated in doing so. And I talked to some youth activists and they said that was something they wished they'd had from the beginning, was knowing that other kids and other youth cared about these things, because they felt very isolated at first. And local activism in particular, where you're seeing people in person or even online, through social media or through where you actually have large Zoom calls with kids across the country, can help you feel part of a bigger community. And then
what's something simple that you know, a young child can do to get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So the activity I recommend in the book is to research an environmental issue in your town and then write a letter or email to your mayor or to your city council. Sorry. Dylan,
they're knocking on your door to go to Capitol.
I know, guys. And to write a letter to city council or to your county council, whatever is relevant.
Because, you know, in my town, actually, a group of children wrote a song and they went and played the guitar to talk about climate change. It was fascinating. So even kids can actually get up and stand up and talk at a city council meeting. You wouldn't expect it, but it can be very touching. One of
the kids I interviewed for the book was only, I think he was maybe he was 10 when he started. He was 10 when he started. And he spoke up at Bureau of Land Management meetings. He testified at these Bureau of Land Management meetings about the national parks. One of the kids I talked to is the youngest kid on the federal lawsuit against the federal government. And I saw him speak at the climate march. But even just speaking at your city council and seeing a kid get up there and speak is so powerful. And city government has a lot of influence, and it's like easily the easiest, fastest way to see change, because the federal government, it's very hard to see change. You know, you call your congressperson a million times, but you email a local city person and they will get back to you, usually. Not always, but usually. And so you can really see change on that level. And that's very empowering too. And that's a good way to start. And that's less frustrating maybe than approaching it at the national level.
Do you think that there's more opportunities now than when we were kids? I know you're a little younger than I am, but I mean, I don't remember this being at the forefront at all in the 80s and 90s during my childhood. So it's exciting to see so many kids and teens involved now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's more, because of online culture especially, it's easier to find out about these things in part and find out how to participate. I think there's more of a willingness and an interest in engaging young people in the environmental movement in particular. The civil rights movement has always been very good about engaging young people. You know, you look back to the 60s and the Children's March and things like that. But the environmental movement in particular was kind of an, you know, old white dude movement for a long time, and involving youth and having youth lead it in particular, I think is both relatively recent, but also a very good change.
So back to like, what would you say is the real difference between the activism and the volunteerism?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't identify it in the book. Volunteerism, I would say, is about working within current systems that, so you're not trying to change policy, you're not necessarily trying to change decisions that the government makes, you're not changing the systems sort of from the inside out. You're, you know, cleaning up streams, you're helping in a community garden, which itself is in a way changing systems because you're changing your food system, but they're not changing policy. They're not changing how money's spent. They're not changing kinds of rules. Activism is much more about changing those systems and about trying to influence people in power and find ways to leverage power. And that's, like I said, that's an incredibly useful thing to understand as a kid. And when kids just feel like everybody's always telling them what to do, you know, I can't do anything, I'm just a kid. Knowing that you can, and you can change actual systems, is pretty amazing. But volunteering has really, you know, is really important work as well. You know, somebody's got to be there to do those things. It's sort of like a lot of times volunteering is kind of the emergency people, and activism is the like making long-term change so you don't need as many of those emergency people. You know, yes, we clean the beach so that the turtles don't choke on things, but hopefully we'll have less plastic in the long term so you don't have to clean the beach in the first place.
Very good point. So what are your favorite environmental volunteer activities for your family?
Yeah, we did a stream cleanup, which was super fun. We went down and they gave us gloves and those like garbage picker things, which my kids thought hilarious. And my parents came down and the 6 of us all volunteered one day, and the amount of trash in that stream was just staggering. Like, we've just felt like, you know, and it's a stream that runs right through a park, a city park, right next to the playground. I wouldn't mind my kids playing in it as long as it's not full of trash, you know? So, and they remembered that, and they remember, you know, oh yeah, when we went to go clean up the faraway park. And so that was a lot of fun. If I lived near a beach, I think we'd probably do a lot of that, but we've lived pretty far from the beach. We don't have a lot of community gardens, but we do have one across the street that unfortunately is closed right now because COVID. But next year I'm hoping to help out with that at the community center, which is across the street in the community garden there, that they tend it with the kids in the after school program. So.
Well, that actually leads me to the next question, since you brought up COVID. So what kind of limitations have you seen, and what can families still do when it comes to activism and volunteerism in this social distancing world that we're living in?
Absolutely.
Any new ideas that you have? Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not having probably organized things like stream cleanups and beach cleanups, but there's no reason you can't do those on your own. As long as you bring a garbage bag and some gloves and, you know, talk to your kids about what to touch or not to touch, then there's no reason you can't go do those things on your own. You know, picking up garbage, you know, from along the road, things like that as well. You can, you know, a lot of times cities will ask, or if you ask the city, you know, is there a place that, you know, you need help planting trees or taking care of trees? There's a lot of cities that have tree maintenance groups, tree planting and tree maintenance groups. I know in DC, there's a group called Casey Trees, and I'm sure those volunteers are still out there doing it, not in groups right now, but individually, you know, making sure the trees are watered, making sure that, you know, things are not intruding on them, that they're in good health, and alerting the city when they're not, that sort of thing. So And then in terms of activism, you can always email. A lot of places are still accepting phone calls, not all of them, but a lot of them are accepting phone calls. You can post on social, you can take photos and post on social media, make like a poster and post on social media and tag your local legislature or tag your local council members. A lot of them are on Twitter and on Facebook, post their pages. So any way to get the word out to, policymakers that what you feel about. And one thing that's actually going to be super, super important is the globe's greenhouse gas footprint went down, and the amount of pollution we created went down during COVID. It will go back up if we really make an effort to invest in clean energy, to invest in places, in cleaning up diesel. The places that are the hardest hit by COVID are in part because the air is so polluted there. Yeah, a lot of the, especially, inner city places near ports where there's those very large ships that have almost no pollution control, places near highways that have a lot of diesel trucks go by, especially older diesel trucks, shipping trucks. And because it's a respiratory disease in part, if you already have respiratory problems like asthma, like high blood pressure, which is actually related to pollution, not respiratory, but it's related to pollution, you're going to suffer more from and be at higher risk for COVID. So it's very much an environmental justice issue. It's tied together, and now is the time to really make sure that we're making the investments that we need to make to get out of this that are going to benefit everybody and be, clean and green, and not just go back to the way things were.
And also really kind of realizing that maybe you don't need to get in your car so often. I mean, just how there's so much right here in my own home, in my backyard, to enjoy that I don't need to get in the car very often anymore. And I hope more people do recognize that and try to bike and walk more.
Yeah, and that's my book. The chapter is all on biking, walking, and public transit, which obviously people are taking too much these days unless you have to. But one of the things I talk about is biking and walking is an amazing way to get to know your neighbors. And right now it's a socially distanced way to see your neighbors. We see our friends from down the street going to the park all the time while we're out in the yard. And we're like, oh, hi, so at least we see them. And every time we go for a bike ride, we see people we know, because you're moving slower. You have a chance to actually say hello to people. You have a chance to actually see people in a way that you wouldn't be able to in a car.
The other aspect I was thinking about was fundraising. So, would you say that falls more into, both activism and volunteerism? And, that there are a lot of creative ways that, especially now, a child could do some fundraising and then donate, during this time. That way, without leaving their house, right? Especially online.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of depends on what you're fundraising for. So I did the Climate Ride, which is a ride from New York City to Washington, D.C., and it was fundraising for groups specifically looking to change policy. So 350.org, Rails to Trails is more on the volunteering side, but benefited Rails to Trails also, and other groups like that. Whereas you can also fundraise for something that, like, for example, Nature Conservancy doesn't do a lot of policy work, but they buy land to conserve it, or groups that save the manatees. I did a fundraiser when I was a kid, and we adopted a manatee as part of my third grade class. And they mainly do more local conservation work, not so much on the policy side. I think they do some policy these days too, but mainly.
Can you recommend a fun way for a family to fundraise from home and stuck at home?
Online is always great. Climate Ride is actually right now running where you do virtual events, where you maybe like do a certain amount of running outside or like on a stationary bike or whatever.
Oh, Sierra Club does that too, right? Oh, yeah. I just thought, that was an interesting option for people if they're finding that some places are closed, that they can still, fundraise in some way. They could do anything from selling their art online or, asking their relatives or bake sale. Really, I think the options are endless. You had mentioned environmental justice. And, one of the best parts I thought about your book was how current it was. Like, as I was reading it, I'm like, is she psychic or something? Because of what's going on in the news with George Floyd's death and the protests and all this, the racism being top of mind. So, you know, how do you recommend people kind of educate their children, or how can they do something, some activism or volunteerism that can help the environmental justice movement?
Absolutely. I think really thinking first and foremost, who has access to things? That's a big one. You know, if when you go camping and everybody around you is white, thinking about, wonder why that is. And there's a lot of historical and both current, unfortunately, racism in the outdoors, historically in the outdoors movement, and then also, you know, people feel unsafe being in more isolated places, you know, because they've had bad experiences. And so thinking about who has access to places in nature, who is sort of affected the most by things like air pollution, by climate change. It's places that are going to be hit the hardest with hurricanes, which will be hit the hardest with heat waves, which will be hit the hardest with bad air quality days. And then thinking about, okay, when we do activism, when we say that we want to change these systems, how do we do it? Who are we working with? Whose kind of lead are we following? Who are we including in our activism, and who are we leaving out? Thankfully, a lot of the youth-led climate groups in particular are very purposeful in being environmental justice groups and not just in climate justice groups, not just environmental groups, because traditionally a lot of the big environmental groups have left people out, and they're really trying hard. Sierra Club in particular has been, I think, on the forefront, not the forefront, because, you know, they're a big group, they're slower than like some of the smaller groups, but I think of the big groups has been sort of have kept this the most top of mind. And I've noticed this in their things for quite a while. One of the reasons they was because a while back, a group that was anti-immigrant actually tried to take over their board, essentially. Yeah, right? And so they realized, well, we have a problem if that was even like possible. And so they really tried to commit to it. And like way back even, it had to be 7 years ago because it was while I was pregnant. They worked with like the Hip Hop Caucus and I forgot what I think Indigenous Environmental Movement, Indigenous Environmental Network, that's what it is. And like, you know, again, trying to follow the lead of the people who are the most affected. So I guess those are the things, is think about, you know, who has access, who's affected the most by the things that have the negative effects, and then how do we follow the lead of those folks so that we're not leaving them out of the conversation, and in fact, they are leading the conversation if possible. And Hip Hop Caucus is a good one. They work with 350.org. 350.org is at least someone on top of this.
What was it called?
Environmental Network. Sorry?
What was it called?
Oh, the Hip Hop Caucus.
Oh, interesting. Never heard
of
it.
They do a lot of stuff, but they've had a particular interest in climate change, at least for like 7 years now, because I remember him speaking at the Climate March. I'm trying to think of other really intersectional groups. And then any of the youth-led climate ones, U.S. Youth Climate Strike, Earth Guardians, I forgot one of the other ones' names.
There's some interesting groups locally if you dig a little bit. Down here in Florida, there's a fabulous group called Community Gardening, and their goal is to plant more trees, and both fruit trees and other kinds of trees in communities that don't have enough of the trees. And it's really like reached out to communities that never really had that ability to, the opportunity to appreciate it, and now they're loving. They're going, you know, it's going down the street to this fruit tree garden, and they're picking mangoes, and it's building like this incredible community and education around nature, and it boosts their happiness so much, because otherwise it's just like cement, right? Like they don't have the tree canopy. And so I'm trying to get involved with that group because it's really inspiring.
Yeah, the food justice movement is definitely one of those areas where volunteering and activism overlap, because in just growing your own food, that is changing the system. And in providing food, fresh food grown sustainably to people who don't normally have access to it, to often the kinds are called food deserts, but I'm trying to,
Yes.
I think someone recently said they called it food apartheid, because it was a food desert suggested sort of this natural phenomena that just happens, when no, it was a policy decision to not place grocery stores in these places or make it difficult to put grocery stores in these places. And that itself is a fundamental system change. And in fact, a group I used to volunteer with was very much in that, and it was by far the most diverse group I've ever worked with, and I don't think that's coincidental. It was in DC, and our focus was mainly on the food justice, but particularly in growing like community gardens and things like that.
Yeah, Google's your friend if you're, and you could probably have better luck finding something locally than nationally when it comes to something as specific, and then to find out how your family can get involved and volunteer. It's a lot easier.
Some groups in cities that are specific for families, I talk about in the book Austin Allies, which is a group in Austin, Texas, that specifically sets up volunteer activities for kids. I know Sierra Club usually has different chapters, and they often have a lot of kid-specific or family-specific activities because they know families get involved. In terms of volunteering, a lot of Audubon centers have a lot of family activities. So that's more on the sort of outdoor volunteering side, less activism.
And then, of course, there's children's groups like Roots and Shoots.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts.
Yes, yes.
So do you have any good resources to get families started in all of this? I know throughout your book, but do you have any you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of just listed them. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, of course, have that as part of their core mission. Roots and Shoots, which is Jane Goodall's group, and they have sort of chapters all over the country, and they work on both sort of the natural history volunteering side, as well as sort of the more like helping people more, like not just helping people be in the environment, but helping people more directly side. In terms of, I'm going to look at my book now and cheat.
The other thing I'll jump in and say, given the fact that the election is coming up, there's probably a lot that families can do to help support pro-environmental candidates as well.
Yeah, one of the things we did a couple of years ago, and I think I'm going to do again because I'm getting a bunch from the mail, is write postcards to voters.
Yeah, we were doing that
too. Or write them themselves, and it's a really fun thing. In terms of activism, Climate Parents is a really cool group. It's a subset of Sierra Club. And I spoke to the woman who runs it. She's lovely. Kids Speak for Parks, which is run by the kid who was only like, I think it was, or maybe he was 12 when he started. And it's about helping support the national parks, kids supporting the national parks. The Sunrise Movement, which is more for older, like teenagers, but they have a really good focus on teenagers and college students. Earth Uprising and Earth Guardians. Earth Uprising is started by this young Indigenous leader who's actually the youngest person to speak in front of the UN ever. At least at the time that he spoke, I think about 5 years ago. But, everybody talked about Greta Thunberg, but he actually spoke in front of the UN before she did, as important as her work is. And the Earth Uprising, which was started by Alexandra Villeneuve, who is the person who's organized the U.S. Youth Climate Strike. So the main organizer. And then in terms of volunteering, there we go. Some good ones are obviously Boy Scouts. Free Forest School. They're not, this is for like really little kids, but they do, basically it's a lot of parents are looking at like more kindergarten, like forest preschool, forest kindergartens now. And they run usually things on weekends that are kind of like let the kids roam around and be collectively together. They may be interested in doing like a more, not organized sort of thing, but more volunteerish sort of thing, possibly. Children in Nature Network, which has amazing resources on how to get your kids out in general. Oh, and American Rivers is a really good one. They organize a lot of the stream and river cleanups.
It's great. Well, your book is filled with so much incredible information. I think all parents have to read it. I highly recommend it. I give it 5 stars, and I hope they will. And I hope you'll get a lot of good feedback about what they're doing and how they're making a difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate it. You know, if you're watching this after the fact, please let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I will respond. Or if you're on Sandy's page, she'll respond. Or she can ping me to respond. And thank you so much. And please check out my book, Bring Sustainable Together. The link is in the description.
And don't forget to go to my page to check out the book review, because I'm giving away 3 of her books, and only for the next couple of days. So go in there, leave a comment, and you'll get entered into the contest.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.